Greetings and welcome back. In this video we are going to talk about the Satin layer style effect. Now the purpose of the Satin layer style effect is to make your layer look like it's had a satiny kind of silky surface stretched across it. Kind of like an anisotropic effect. If you've ever taken a look at satin fabric and seen how light and shadow kind of plays across the surface because of the shininess and the direction of the fiber, that's kind of what we're going for when we use this. Now, I'll be the first to admit I don't often find myself reaching for it, but occasionally for very specific special effects where you need an interesting looking shadow within a shape, it can be pretty handy. So let's take a look at applying this. First off, I'm just going to select my stick figure layer, and I'll go down to the Effects button and just click on Satin. Now you can see the result here. The inside of our shape has darkened up and the outer edge is still pretty bright. There's a very thin area of softening that takes place in between the two. And before I even take a moment and look at the settings, I want to kind of show you how this is being done. If you take the distance slider and you start to really slide it apart, at some point your satin is just going to look like garbage and you won't be able to use it for much of anything. But if you keep going, if you look really closely, you can kind of see what's happening. Two negative shapes that are literally the shape of your layer intersect one another and create the final look. So here it looks kind of satiny. Here it looks like, well, garbage, and you can see those two shapes. It's like two stick figures back there in the background, which merge together, and they create the effect. So understanding that will help you kind of see how a lot of these other settings work. So let's start off with our very first ones, which is the blend mode and the color. Of course, you don't have to have black, and you don't have to use multiply if you don't really want to, but we could set this to, just for example, set it to a brilliant, obnoxious shade of green, and then set the blend mode to color, and now we're kind of blending in some nasty green into red, which is a pretty terrible color, but you see, you get the point of what's going on there. Generally speaking, though, if you're really going for an actual satin look, black and multiply will be your go-to settings, just so you know. Now, you can also change the opacity, and that has a pretty straightforward response. It's just controlling how much that darkening effect is going to be present. I don't want to jump around too much here in the settings, but I will point out that by default, this does come in inverted. So if you uncheck that inversion, you're darkening the edges and leaving the top, kind of like the flat surface on top of your shape, is going to have its original color. So you can play with that and see which one works best for you. Now, next you have the angle. And this, technically, this is kind of like changing the angle of the threads on a satiny surface, so it's kind of giving you control over how that anisotropic result turns out. And if you're unfamiliar with anisotropic, when I say that, that's referring to surfaces that have micro grooves carved into them. Think of brushed steel or the underside of a compact disc, that sort of thing. And as you can see, it's changing the nature of that outer edge. And if you really want to see what's doing, crank your distance up really far again, and in effect, it's controlling the angle at which those two negative shapes that, again, are just the shape of your layer, it controls the angle at which they intersect one another. So if I pull this way apart and I set this to something around 90 degrees, you can see they're intersecting each other from above and below, where if I set it to something off to the side, such as 0 to 1 degree, you see they're intersecting each other from left to right. So you're just controlling that angle at which those two shapes are coming into contact. Of course, we've already seen distance. This just spreads out those two negative shapes which are being used to calculate that kind of satiny result. Do watch out, of course, if you crank this up too far, you can't even tell what's going on. You lose the effect. So generally, you're only going to be playing with the first few pixels or so in this whole thing. Now, moving on from here, we have size. This controls the softening. So if you take a close look there, you can see that the blur area in between full intensity and the darken area just kind of gets bigger. So it's like applying a Gaussian blur to the whole thing. Now, you can control the mapping of that transition from no shading to complete shading through your contour editor. So we could set this to its standard linear form. We can change the curvature of that to anything we like. We could even do something crazy like an up and down, and you can see how we go from no shading to a little shading, back toward no shading, and then to full shading. So you'll also see that reflected here in the curve. I'll go ahead and set that back over to Gaussian so we get a nice S-curve, and click OK. You've seen invert already. That just takes the effect and flips it around if you need to do that. And then, of course, you can anti-alias the effect, but since this is something that is generally softened anyway, anti-aliasing won't have too much of a visible result. Finally, at the bottom, we have the buttons that we've come to expect in all of these other layer styles, at least in terms of CS5. We can reset them back to their default settings, or we can make the current settings the default. So that's pretty much it. It's a very, very basic layer style. Again, I tend not to use it that much, but every so often for a particular special effect, it does come in pretty handy. That will, however, wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot for watching.